Hello, my friends. Today we will be reading another audiobook for you. This one is called Property and Capital, framing in the Marxist doctrine the phenomena of the contemporary social world. This work was written somewhere in between 1948 and 1952, throughout 7 issues of the journal that went by the name of Prometeo. There are a few different prefaces that were written by groups who reproduced this text. There is a preface, or a presentation as they call it, from N+1 from 1991, before they ever took the name N+1, when they were still the Quaderni Internazionale. There is a new preface from 2019 from them. There is also, I believe, if my memory does not fail me, a sort of note for readers, written by Il Partito in 2023, when they translated this text. I feel like reading through these, especially at the beginning, would be quite unnecessary. The text itself is already quite voluminous. We have about 100 pages in a PDF format, and you can find the English translation on our website. We will begin with part 1, which was published to Prometeo in 1948 in issue number 10. Section 1. Productive technology and legal forms of production. Socialism has always been defined with a simple formula justified by the needs of propaganda as the abolition of private property. Adding to this the specification of the means of production and then another of the means of exchange. Although this formula is incomplete and not entirely adequate, it should not be rejected. But the old and recent fundamental questions about personal, collective, national, and social property make it necessary to clarify the issue of property in respect of the historical theoretical antithesis and struggle between capitalism and socialism. Every economic and social relationship is projected into legal formulations, and starting from this position, the manifesto says that communists bring the property question to the fore at every stage of the movement, because they bring the production question to the fore, and more generally that of production, distribution, and consumption, i.e., that of the economy. In an era when the great historical antithesis between the feudal and bourgeois regimes first appeared as a conflict based on ideology and legal rights, rather than as an economic relationship and a change in the forms of production, it was impossible not to put the legal form of proletarian economic and social claims in the sharpest relief, even in the most elementary utterances. In the fundamental passage of the preface to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx sets out the doctrine of the contrast between the forces of production and the forms of production and immediately adds, quote, "Or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto." End quote. The correct meaning of the legal formulation can therefore only be based on the correct presentation of the productive and economic relationships that socialism seeks to break. Therefore, insofar as it is useful to adopt the language of the current science of law, it is a question of recalling the discriminating characteristics of the capitalist type of production, which must be defined in relation to the types of production that preceded it, and further distinguishing within these characteristics between those which socialism will preserve and those which it will have to overcome and suppress in the revolutionary process. This distinction must obviously be established in the field of economic analysis. Capitalism does not coincide with property. Various socio-economic forms that preceded capitalism had their own specific institutions of ownership. We will see at once that it was convenient for the new system of production to base its legal framework on formulas and canons derived directly from previous regimes, despite the fact that in those regimes the relation of appropriation were very different. And no less elementary is the thesis that in the socialist vision capitalism appears as the last of the economies founded on a legal form of property, so that socialism in abolishing capitalism will also abolish property. But that first abolition, and to put it better, violent and revolutionary suppression, is a clearly dialectical relationship, as stated with greater fidelity to our own Marxist language, than the abolition of property of a somewhat metaphysical and apocalyptic flavor. Let us, however, refer back to the start of our well-known concepts. Property is a relationship between man, the human person, and things. Jurists call it the faculty to dispose of the thing in the most extensive and absolute way, and classically to use and abuse it. It is known that we Marxists don't like these eternal definitions, and we could give a better dialectical and scientific definition of the right of property by saying that it's the power of another person or group to prevent a human person from using a given thing. The historical variability of the relationship can be seen, for example, in the fact that for centuries and millennia, the same human person was susceptible to being himself the object of property, to be a slave. On the other hand, we have proved 1,000 times by referring to the primitive communist society in which property did not exist, since everything was acquired and used in common by the first human groupings, that the institution of property cannot claim the apologetic prerogative of being natural and eternal. In a relative primordial economy, or you could say the pre-economy, the relationship between man and thing was as simple as possible. Because of the limited number of human beings and the limited range of needs, which are barely greater than an animal need for food, the things that satisfy these needs, which the law later called goods, are made available by nature without limit, and only productive act is to take them when they are needed. They are limited to the fruits of wild vegetation, and later to hunting and fishing and so on. They were useful objects in abundance. They were not yet products that came out of an embryonic physical technical manufacturing intervention of man on the material offered by the natural environment. With work, the technology of production, the increase in population, and the shortage of free virgin land on which to expand, distribution problems arise, and it becomes difficult to cope with all the demands for the use and consumption of products. Conflict arises between individual and individual, tribe and tribe, people and people. There is no need to recall these stages of the origin of property, that is, the appropriation of what has been produced through the work of humans and communities for consumption, for building up reserves, for the initial exchange to satisfy other, ever-expanding needs. Commerce appears in various processes. Things that were formerly only objects of use become merchandise. Currency appears, and exchange value is superimposed on use value. We have to understand in the various peoples and in the various periods of history how productive technology evolved with regards to the capacity of human work to be applied to objects or raw materials. What was the mechanism of production and distribution of productive acts and efforts among the various members of society? How did the circulation of products play out from hand to hand, from house to house, from country to country with respect to consumption? We can move on from these facts to understand the corresponding legal forms, which tended to coordinate the rules of these processes, assigning the regulation to given organizations, together with the possibility of imposing constraints and sanctions against transgressors. Just as the ownership of things or commodities for consumption and the ownership of slaves does not go back to primitive humanity, the same applies to the ownership of the soil, that is to say, to the land and all that man adds to it and builds upon it, immovable property, as it is referred to in law. Such property in its primitively owned form comes later than movable property and slaves, because at the beginning everything that is not commonly owned is at least attributed to the head of the familial grouping or tribe or city and region. But even if we want to dispute that all people started from this first communistic form, and even if we wanted to talk ironically about such a golden age, the analysis that interests us about the derivation of the legal institution from the stages of technology is not affected by it. And it is enough to refer to the great importance that Engels and Marx placed on these studies of prehistory from the very start, pushing us to go much further. If we limit ourselves to the skeletal outlines and the things known to all, the relations as to the ownership of the consumable and otherwise usable movable object, of the slave or serf, and of the land, this will suffice to define the fundamental outlines of successive historical types of class society. Property, says the jurist, arises from ownership. He says this with immovable property, real estate, in mind, but the formula also applies to ownership of the slave and the commodity object. In fact, movable things belonging to the possessor. No less obvious is the transition from possession to ownership. If I have anything in my hands in general, even another man or a piece of land, in which case I do not literally hold it in my hands, nor do I constantly hold the man and the commodity in my hands, without another being able to replace me, I am the possessor. Material possession, still. But possession becomes legitimate and lawful and is elevated to the right of ownership when I have the possibility, against a potential claimant or troublemaker, of obtaining the support of the law and the authority, that is the material force organized through the state, which will come to protect me. For movable property or goods, mere possession proves legal ownership until someone proves that I have taken the thing from him by force or by fraud. For the slave in the well-ordered states, there was a family registry that registered him or her with the master. For real estate, even in modern times, the legal machinery is much more complex, depending on titles in given forms and public records. And so the legal control of transfer of ownership is more complex. However, material possession is always a great resource for its expeditious effect, and the law defends it in the first instance, unless in the second there comes the difficult full investigation of the property right. It is said as a legal paradox that even the thief can ask the law for possessory protection, if thrown out, perhaps by the actual owner for theoretical absurdity. And the shrewdest legal advocates say that all codes can be reduced to just Article 5. He who holds has won. Thus, at the basis of any property regime, there is a material reality about the appropriation of property in general. The slave's children remained with the master, and if they escaped, he could have the law chase them back to him. Under the medieval feudal regime, the method of production using slave labor and the related legal framework governing the ownership of human beings generally appears to be abolished. This disposition of agrarian land takes on a more complex form than that of the classical Roman law, in that a hierarchy of lords is laid upon it, culminating in a political sovereign who distributes land to independent vassals within a highly complex legal regime. The economic basis is agricultural work, by means not of slaves but of serfs, who are no longer the object of true ownership and alienation from master to master, but who cannot in general leave the fief on which they work with their families. Who appropriates the products of labor? The serf appropriates a certain part, generally being granted a small plot of land, the fruits of which he must suffice to feed himself and his own, while he is required to work alone or with others on the much larger lands of the lord, the more abundant produce of which is delivered to the latter. Such work was bonded labor. In more recent forms, the serf is more like a homesteader in that all the land of the feudal lord is divided into small family farms, but a large share of the product of each is rendered to the master. In this regime, the worker has a partial right to use the products of his labor to consume as he pleases, partial insofar as it is impacted by the payment of tributes, whether in labor time or in foodstuffs, to the feudal master, the clergy, and so on. Non-agricultural production has little development due to the still underdeveloped technology, poor urbanization, and the general primitiveness of the people's lives and needs. But the workers producing manufactured objects are free men, that is, not bound to the place of birth and work. They are artisans, shackled by organizational fetters and guild rules, but nevertheless economically completely autonomous. In artisan production of the small and minimal enterprise and workshop, we have the worker's ownership of several kinds of goods. The uncomplicated tools of labor, the raw materials he buys to process them, and the manufactured products he sells. Apart from the burdens of guilds and communes and even feudal rights over villages, the artisan works only for himself and enjoys the fruit of all of the time and all of the results of his labor. The circulation network of this social system is scarcely intricate. The great mass of farm workers consume what they produce in the place where they work and sell only a small amount to buy the limited items of clothing and other things that they use and need. Artisans and merchants trade with peasants and with each other mostly within narrow circles of towns, villages, and countryside. A small minority of privileged lords draw the object of their enjoyment from greater distances, and until a few centuries ago were themselves virtually ignorant of the forks and soap, etc., to say nothing of 100 other things used by everyone everywhere today. Gradually, however, the foundations of the new capitalist era were being laid, with the technical and scientific discoveries enriching the process of product handling in 1,000 ways, with geographical discoveries and the inventions of new means of transportation of people and goods continually widening the reach of circulation and the distances between the places where products are manufactured and those where they are used. The progress of these transformations is extremely varied and can entail both inexplicable sluggishness and overwhelming growth. While from the beginning of the modern epoch already millions of consumers were learning about and using previously unknown and exotic spices and commodities, causing new needs to emerge, coffee, tobacco, etc., it was still possible at the time of World War I to hear that a lady from Calabria, a large landowner, had in 1 year spent a total of quote-unquote 1 penny for needles and everything else being provided to her by her estate. Having arrived at this solid position based on the recollection of these few signs, deliberately simplified, but attempting to put the right words in the proper place, let us ask what are the real characteristics that differentiate the new capitalist production and economy and the bourgeois regime for which it provides the basis. And we see at once, in what really constitutes the transformation, that the new technological systems, the new forces of production placed at man's disposal, induce after a long and hard struggle in the relations of production. That is, in the possibilities and faculties of appropriation of the various goods, as opposed to what took place in the previous feudal and artisan society. We will thus begin to clearly establish the basis of our further inquiry into the actual relations between the capitalist system and the form of the appropriation of various goods, ready-to-consume commodities, tools of labor, land, houses, and various fixed installations. And we will extend it to the process of the development of the capitalist era, and of course that of its end. Here was the conclusion of part 1. Let's just directly proceed with part number 2. This one is also from 1948, but it was published in Prometeo number 11. Section 2. The advent of capitalism and property relations. The rise of the capitalist economy in its effects on property relations appears not as an establishment of private property rights, but as their widespread abolition. The thesis formulated in this way should appear neither strange nor new, as it is entirely in accordance in substance and in form with Marx's exposition. With regards to the feudal landlords, the bourgeois revolution consisted in a radical abolition of privileges, but not in a suppression of the right of ownership over land. We should not think here of the revolution in the sense of a brief period of struggle, the measures against the rebels and émigrés, or even the subsequent measures to suppress the privileges on the land of religious bodies, but refer to the social-economic content of the Great Transformation, which in its unfolding begins long before and ends long after the classical dates of insurrections, proclamations, and promulgators of new statutes. The advent of capitalism has the character of a wide-ranging destruction of property rights with regard to the substantial class of small-scale artisanal producers, and to a large degree, and especially in given nations, also at the expense of the working peasant owners. The story of the birth of capitalism and primitive accumulation coincides with the story of the fierce, inhuman expropriation of producers and is delivered in the most finely sculpted pages of Capital. The concluding chapter of the first volume, like other fundamental writings of Marxism, presents the future overthrow of capitalism as the expropriation of the erstwhile expropriators, and even, but we shall deal with this in the latter part of this text, as a vindication of the erstwhile property destroyed and trampled underfoot. For all this to be clearly understood, it is precisely necessary to follow the investigation into the correct application of our method, and never to lose sight of the relations that run between the formations of current language or law, and those specific to us Marxist socialists. The explanation of the establishment of capitalism in the field of productive technology is related to the manifold refinements of the application of human labor to processed materials. It begins with the first technological innovations born on the workbench of the patient and skillful individual craftsman, runs through a formidable cycle with the rise of the first factories working at first by hand, then based on the machines that are controlled by an operator but replace the hand of the worker, and later on with the use of powerful mechanical driving forces. In modern times, capitalism appears to us as the formidable complex of plants, constructions, works, and machinery with which technology has covered the ground of the most advanced countries, and therefore it seems obvious to define the capitalist system as that of ownership and monopoly of these colossal modern means of production, a definition which is only partially accurate. The technical conditions of the new economy consist of new methods based on the differentiation of tasks and division of labor. But historically, even before this phenomenon, we have a simpler one of the coming together of many workers in a common place of work. They continue to work with the same technology and using the simple tools they used when they were isolated and autonomous. Thus, the truly distinctive character of innovation does not lie in the appearance of a possessor or conqueror of new equipment or great machinery, which by producing the manufactured goods more easily supplant traditional craft production. These large plants come later, since, as Marx says, for simple cooperation, i.e. the grouping together of many workers, all that is needed is primitive premises that can be easily hired by the master. And indeed, in the sweating system, workers can remain in their homes, domestic labor. The distinctive characteristic is therefore elsewhere. It is a negative characteristic, and therefore destructive and revolutionary. Workers have been deprived of the possibility of owning the raw materials and the tools of labor on their own behalf, and thus are no longer the owners of what they produce by their labor, and are no longer free to consume and sell it as they please. Therefore, to recognize an early capitalist economy in operation, it is sufficient for us to note that there are masses of artisan producers who have lost the ability to procure materials and tools, And as a further condition, buying power has been concentrated in considerable volumes in the hands of the new economic actors, the capitalists, enabling them on the one hand to hoard the materials and tools of labor, and on the other hand to purchase the labor power of artisans who become wage earners, leaving the capitalists as absolute possessors and owners of the product of labor in its entirety. Corresponding to the second condition is the primitive accumulation of capital, whose origin is studied in other contributions to the knowledge of Marxism, and which arises from multiple historical and economic factors. That the mere act of bringing workers closer together is enough to make the new system superior and enables it to supplant the old system is explained by the reduced effort involved in transportation and procurement, as well as the better utilization of the time that producers devote to the still technologically very simple stages of production. We have an initial breakthrough in performance compared with artisan labor in isolated workshops, but this is conclusively overtaken by further developments resulting from the division of labor. It is no longer the single craftsman assisted by one or two apprentices who assembles the manufactured product. Rather, this arises from the successive contributions of different tradesmen, none of whom would know how to do it, nor be able to do it alone. Further still, many of the most difficult operations previously done by hand after a long apprenticeship are carried out using a machine, and the same outcome in production is achieved with much less effort, in the physical and mental sense, expended by the operator. Following this process, we see the rapid expansion of the factory's mass of equipment, which of course does not legally belong to the worker, just as when simple hand tools already do not belong to him in general in the initial stage either. But the legal ownership of these large factories by the capitalist and employer is not a necessary condition. We have proved this by recalling that even before such factories appeared, we had true social and economic capitalism with early manufacturing. We can observe many cases where in the modern economy the production plants are not the legal property of the business owner. For now, let it suffice to mention rents, concessions, contracts, and so on in industry and in agriculture, the great capitalist tenacities. The real circumstance that allows us to confirm the advent of capitalism thus lies in addition to primitive accumulation, in the quote-unquote violent separation of the producer from the tools and products of his labor. Capitalism, economically and socially, appears as a destruction of the worker's ability to appropriate products, and their appropriation by the capitalist. With the loss of all rights over the goods produced, obviously the worker lost all rights over tools, raw materials, and the workplace. These rights were an individual property relationship that capitalism destroyed to replace them with a new right of appropriation, of ownership, which is necessarily a right over the products of labor, but not necessarily a similar right over the means of production. The legal ownership of the latter can also change without the company ceasing to be capitalist in character. What is more, the new kind of appropriation is not necessarily, since we are talking about capitalism in Marxist terms, a right of an individual and personal kind, as it was in artisanal economy, which seldom extended beyond the confines of the family. Capitalism, according to Marx, since we merely are expounding the doctrine as it has always been professed, is not only established by expropriation, but also establishes an economy and thus a type of social property. We could classically speak of personal property when it means the ownership of productive and economic activities by a single person, but when labor becomes the collective and associated function of many producers, which is a fundamental and indispensable feature of capitalism, ownership over the whole of the enterprise is a fact of social scope and order, even if the legal title mentions only one person. This concept, essential in Marxism, unfolds directly into that of the class struggle and the class antagonism inherent in the capitalist system. The appropriation of products by the employer who no longer has slaves and serfs but free wage laborers is a relationship that is shifted to the social level in which no longer affects only one master and 100 workers, but the whole working class pitted against the new system of rulers and the political force it is founded with a new type of state. The social function is made clear in the Marxist law of accumulation and progressive reproduction of capital. The slave master and the feudal landowner derived their personal income from the surplus labor provided by their employees, but they could very easily consume it all without the economic system ceasing to function at the social level. The portion of the products of their labor left to the slaves and serfs was enough for them to survive and perpetuate the system. Therefore, the property right of the master of slaves and serfs is truly an individual right. No less individual is the right of the free peasant and the artisan, who do not render surplus labor to anyone. There was not yet any taxation in those regimes, the state came very cheap, and can consume all the fruits of labor, which coincides with that of their meager possession of the little land or a small workshop, in the sense of a business as opposed to the actual premises. The capitalist does indeed derive a profit from the unpaid surplus labor of his workers, whom he only pays enough to live on, But the fundamental feature in the new economy is not that he, in theory and according to the written law, can consume all the profit personally. Instead, it is a general and social fact that capitalists must reserve an increasingly large part of the profit for new investments, for the reproduction of capital. This new and fundamental fact has more importance than that of profit consumed by who do not work. While this relationship is more suggestive and has always lent itself to more counter-propaganda on legal or moral grounds against apologists for the bourgeois regime, the fundamental law of capitalism is, for us, the other, namely, allocation of a large part of profit to the accumulation of capital. Distinguishing features of the emergence of the capitalist economy are thus the accumulation, in the hands of a few individuals, of masses of means of acquisition, which can be used to purchase work materials and tools on the market, and the suppression of the very possibility of owning materials, tools, and products of labor for the broad strata of autonomous producers. In our Marxist language, this is valid to explain the genesis of the industrial capitalists on the one hand, and the masses of wage laborers with no income on the other. And this, we are wont to say, was the result of a social and political economic revolution. However, we do not pretend that the bourgeoisie and neo-capitalists accomplished this process by winning power in the Civil War and then enacting a law that said it is forbidden for those who do not belong to the victorious capitalist class to buy raw materials, implements, and machines and to sell manufactured products. Things happened quite differently. Today it is still not forbidden by law to be an artisan. Not only that, but today, as capitalist accumulation accelerates to its truly hellish pace before our eyes, we see the fascists, National Socialists, and Christian Socialists competing in their apologia for the artisan, in chorus with an old infatuation of the Mazanians. And the same must be said for the autonomous agricultural producer who owns his own little plot of land. The actual process of primitive accumulation was different, and it can be presented using the language of current philosophy and ethics along with that of positive law, which is not a good fit with the language of Marxism. Property as the right to dispose of the products of one's own labor in the early dawn of capitalism was still defended by conservative ideologies and theologians, satirized by Marx for their embarrassment at the passage of property into the hands of those who do nothing. However, all their theories on the justification of capitalist profit from savings, abstinence, and previous personal labor failed to moralize the fact that the pin maker cannot pocket one when leaving the workshop without making himself guilty of grand larceny. In the prevailing legal system, the ownership by a single person of a store, a factory, a stock of materials to be processed, as well as the finished products, was a property relationship excluded neither by the old codes of the feudal regime nor by those elaborated by the bourgeois revolution. However, the socio-economic relationship is made clear in the light of Marxism by the consideration of the value of the product relative to the amount of labor power required to make it. If that product can be produced in 4 hours when you manufactured, whereas the artisan produces it in 8, the artisan endowed with his full right of ownership will be able to take it to the market. But he will collect a price reduced by half, with which he will not be able to purchase enough to cover his daily subsistence. Since he cannot physically work 16 hours a day in order to balance his budget, he will be forced to accept the capitalist condition, that is, to work, say, 12 hours for the capitalist and to hand over the products of his labor, receiving in wages equivalent of 6 hours of labor, with which he can live, albeit more miserably. This brutal and fierce transition contains within itself the necessary condition for the progress of productive technology. Only by subtracting from the artisan enslaved to capital that margin of value of his labor power that can the social basis for capital accumulation be created, an economic fact that accompanies the technical one of the spread of manufacturing facilities and the means of production characteristic of the new scientific and mechanical age. Why then did the establishment of the new system of production and appropriation of the fruits of labor have to, in order to triumph, break certain obstacles in the forms of production, i.e. in the property relations of the old regime? Because there existed a series of sanctions and limiting norms that were contradictory to the new requirements, i.e. the freedom of movement of capitalists, and of capitals, and the availability of the mass of competing suppliers of wage labor. On the one hand, the monopoly of state power by the nobility and the church exposed the first accumulators of capital, merchants, moneylenders, or bankers, to the risk of continual harassment and sometimes spoliation. On the other hand, corporative laws and regulations left the bodies of master craftsmen in the cities with monopoly privileges over the production of certain manufactured articles, and thus over their sale in given territories. And the mass of workers in industry could not have been formed except by freeing the serfs from serfdom and the apprentices and ruined artisan masters from the workshops. Thus, the revolution did not lead to a new positive property code, but it was essential to abolish the old feudal laws that framed the relations of production and trade in the countryside and cities. Considering the capitalist system as opposed to the feudal regime on whose ruins it arose, it must not see the foundation of a new property right, whether attributed to natural or legal persons over the machine, the factory, the railroad, the system of canals, or whatever, as its distinguishing feature. Instead, we must see clearly what the discriminating features are, the true attributes of the capitalist economy, for otherwise we will not be able to follow with certainty the process of its evolution and judge the features of its overcoming. With respect to the evolution of property relations, and remaining for now in the field of the right of ownership over movable things, as we shall say immediately afterwards about the ownership of land and fixed assets, the essential and necessary features of capitalism are as follows. First, the existence of a market economy in which workers must purchase all the basic necessities of life in general terms. Second, the impossibility for workers to appropriate and bring directly to the market the movable things created as the products of their labor, that is, the prohibition of the workers' personal ownership of the product. Third, the payment to workers of the means to acquire the goods and services, generally in amounts less than the value added by them to the products, and the investment of a large part of that surplus in new facilities, accumulation. Based on these basic three criteria, it is necessary to look into whether personal title to ownership over the factory and production facilities is indispensable for the existence of capitalism, and whether there can be not only a purely capitalist economy without such ownership, but even whether at given stages it is convenient for capitalism to disguise it under other forms. Such an investigation will have to be premised by some notable considerations regarding the economic importance of the legal evolution of property rights over land, subsoil, and topsoil by private individuals and firms in contemporary times. And this is the end of section 2.